Meet George, the Unfjordunate Nord. He's currently held prisoner on a Nordic ship headed to Frondelag dungeon. He wasn't captured in an epic battle. His crime was buying all of the town's oil and running naked through the streets. Fortunately for George, he's able to enter his mind palace to pass the time. His story is a series of unfortunate events as he escapes the shackles of his homeland and tries to find fortune elsewhere, because God only knows, he's a broke ass. He was so small and insignificant that they forgot about him, and he was able to sneak away. I have a feeling that they just let him leave. He wasn't worth the hassle. Unfortunately, he was quickly accosted by bandits. He had only a measly 4 dinars to his name, not enough to pay them off. The bandits dragged him around for a couple of days, until they too realised how worthless he is. With even his kinsmen against him, George decided to head south to warmer temperaments. He swore to return one day, to get revenge on his kinsmen. He made it all the way to the border before being captured by looters. Once again, he was let go, and he continued his march all the way into the kingdom of Sturgia, where he arrived at Vladiv Castle, and was promptly turned away as a vagabond. So instead, he visited the castle's settlement of Vladiv, where he rested and recovered from his long journey. He gets to pick his first trait, virile. Man's gotta have his priorities straight. What George needs is men, but men require money. No, that's not why he took the virile trait. Unfortunately, to make money, you usually need money. George could do some delivery quests, or trading quests, but without a horse, he's too slow and will get caught by raiders. He could take on a band of looters, but without a weapon or armour, he's effectively useless. Heading to the next town over, George finds a quest to take 6 sheep to market. The idea here is to find a market that has a high demand for sheep, paying the village notable a set amount and keeping any profit. However, herding the animals is slow business, so George can't really risk travelling too far. Unfortunately, the nearest villages have no demand for sheep. What George needs is a city. But George's virile scent attracts horseflies, infecting the herd. He takes the calculating decision to slaughter the infected, reducing the flock to 5. Continuing on, George is rejected from another castle, before inevitably being captured by bandits. He manages to make a daring escape with 4 of the sheep, but is captured again by a band of deserters, and loses 2 more sheep. He limps to the nearest town, and sells the remaining sheep for a paltry 34 dinars. That villager's trust in George was terribly misplaced. Then, to rub salt in the wound, the deserters raid the village George is staying in, capturing him again. He manages to slip away with his 38 dinars. With no chance of paying back his debt, George flees further south. He arrives at the town of Lycaron of the Northern Empire, and ponders how he should spend his vast wealth. He could hire a single recruit, or he could try and buy some goods to flip at another market. He hears of the huge walled city that the village is bound to, and heads there in search of greater fortune. For the first time, he's accepted into a town, Umbrella of the Northern Empire. It's a modest town, with traders, taverns, a keep and a dungeon. He attempts to find another job from the town's nobles, but the only job he can find requires troops. He recruits a man for 20 dinars, but it's not enough. Another way George could make some money is by taking over the town's gangs. Never mind that the walkover takes 5 minutes, only to get absolutely bodied. The proper way to do this is to buy some companions, but even then, they have to go find them and bring them back, and you know what? If George just presses Alt and W to open up Wand, he can speed up time, and there we go. Once again, George retreats into his mind palace, where he can use his wand for some help. Here, he can access an interactive map, displaying all the information of each town, village, and faction. If he wanted to, he could use this insider information to become filthy rich and influential. Or he could just add them here. Now he can field a massive army. George's wand is incredibly powerful, whether he just wants to save time after a busy day getting beat off by bandits, or if he just wanted to skip the grind and get to the good bits. He could set up a challenge scenario, like George against the world, where he starts with a small kingdom at war with everyone. Or he could use his massive wand to get a wife, George's wand also works in other games, where he can customize to his heart's content. All he has to do is hit Alt and W, and the whole world opens up to him.
Wait, where'd he go?
Are you serious?
Oh no, he's here!
Oh my god!
George wants you to know that you could unlock these Mind Wand powers too for free. So, download Wand for free using my link in the description. It automatically finds your games and is fully customizable. So why not give it a try now, and start playing your games your way. This playthrough, however, is unmodded. So instead, George turns his attention to the arena. The master there explains the tournament system, and suggests we practice, with the possibility of earning a few dinars for keeping the fighters in shape. With no other options, George dedicated all of his effort to the arena. Lord knows he needs the combat experience. His first fight doesn't go so well, scoring one knockout with a javelin, before falling in melee. He returns the next day, this time scoring 2 javelin knockouts, before again falling in melee. Again, he returns. Having managed to knock out 3 fighters, he's finally awarded with 5 dinars. So, George stays at the arena for a few weeks, honing his skills and earning some money. After earning 40 dinar, he still can't afford a weapon. Instead, he hires 2 more recruits, but it's still not enough for the quests. So, he decides to head for the nearest tournament, at Baltakand. Finally, George gets his first victory. He runs into a band of weakened bandits, just about the only thing his 3 recruits can handle.
Let them down!
He frees an Imperial Equite who joins his party, loots 100 dinars, some salt to sell, some boots he puts on, and some food. This means he can actually pay and feed his troops now. Unfortunately, no weapons were looted from the fight. George's oily hands must have dropped the sword he used. They arrive at the village of Payam, where they happen upon some deer they can hunt for some free meat. But at the next town, one of the notables wants George to take some recruits to get battle experience against bandit raids. This adds 5 temporary troops, plus an additional 4 troops puts the party at 14. However, the mounted steppe bandits roam the lands of the Kazay, a frightening force. The party survives the initial charge, and George picks up a pitchfork, but is promptly taken out by archers. Luckily the enemy was disorganised, and the party was able to clinch the victory. Again, no weapons, but George gets a nice hat.
Well now, stranger.
Now that George has the resources that most Bannerlords start with, he can start making some moves. First up is making some real money. He visits all the nearby villages looking for goods to buy and sell, finding a potential flax flip. He gets intercepted by bandits, but with his party of 19, he's able to win handily.
Wasn't me!
And finally, he loots some clothes and a weapon. The battles and flax flips have netted him enough money to start flipping in greater numbers. He buys goods at Baltakand and heads to the coastal town of Mekeb to sell them at massive profit. He can then take more goods like hardwood on the return journey. George decides to put more focus on his trading skills as a result. The battles also upgraded the village recruits, and George gets a hefty 2,000 dinar reward, which is more money than George has ever seen. Rather impulsively, he buys 4 cavalry, before stopping at Fiznar to buy butter and cheese, Azalig to buy a horse, and finally back to Baltakand to sell the goods. He browses the market for equipment upgrades, buying a shield, a cloak, a new head wrap, gloves, and wool to sell at Mekeb. He picks up a selection of goods on the way and makes a massive profit of 3,700 dinars. He buys himself a set of civilian and stealth clothes and weapons. He's starting to look respectable now. George spent the next few weeks running around the Kazay steppes flipping goods, even getting an insanely well-timed event to manipulate the market. He ends up with 11,000 dinars, and even meets the leader of the faction. Eventually, we can enter into the service of kingdoms as a mercenary, but for that, we need more renown. Feeling fortunate, George enters the Baltican tournament, where he discovers that the combatants are much better armed than him, and he promptly gets one shot. With his party at max capacity and 10,000 dinars to his name, George heads out in search of fame and fortune. He finds himself battling bandits in the Nord's territory, and he's majorly overconfident. Seeing some outnumbered deserters fleeing, he gave chase and engaged in battle. Seeing only one ranged unit in their party, he moved in to harass them with his horse archers, while the infantry moved in. Unfortunately, George failed to take into account their army-grade gear and experience, and the fact that the infantry had throwing axes. As his men charged, every last man was slaughtered. The mounted archers put up a valiant defense, but they too were eventually taken down. George was captured, but with only 3 deserters surviving, he was able to slip away. Now he found himself alone, with no supplies, deep inside Nord territory. In terrible trouble, George once again resorted to his mind palace. What he needed was skilled companions. George himself was relatively unskilled, but even as a skilled noble, he would still have skill gaps. Companions can fill these gaps, as well as perform a multitude of tasks for Clan Unfjordunate. So, George made the long and lonely march back to the steppe, paying off any bandits who caught him, and recruiting troops to ward them off. Once he reached a town, he asked around in the taverns for companions, hiring the scout Dagil Trolldaughter, and being told to look for Pazel Bloodaxe in Autumngrad. Then, after a quick battle, George recruited the surgeon Pazel Bloodaxe. He gave the tournament another try, but no dice. He also tried to clear a hideout, but also no dice.
Victory!
Clan Unfjordunate needs more renown. First for Clan Tier 1, so George can lead a mercenary party, then Tier 2, so he can join a kingdom. He can do all of that through questing and fighting. Some quests are relatively easy, and some are not. George decides to head south, not realising that the Kazay lands end in a peninsula,
Leave not a one breathing!
and he has to walk the entire way back. At the very least, he trades and completes some quests along the way. He also enters a couple of tournaments.
Engage the enemy!
Little did George know, this would be his only victory for many years to come. He finally leaves the Kazay steppes and enters the realm of the Western Empire. And after selling some more goods and clearing a hideout, George's clan finally reaches Tier 1. Unfortunately, George is still at war with the Nords. You can only sign up as a mercenary for a kingdom if you share the same enemies or if you're at peace. This is a major setback. George alone can do little, even with his maxed out party of 64 men. Sturgia is the only kingdom at war with the Nords. So he heads to the front line, raiding a few villages as he goes, and meets up with an army laying siege. Unfortunately, George is tricked into approaching the walls alone.
Moving!
As it turns out, they made peace right as the attack started. What a bastard move. As a result, his party is weakened, and he gets captured while raiding a village. As much as it pains him, It seems that George's only option is to make peace with the Nords. He vows not to forget what they did to him. He still finds himself harassed by bandits. So he decides to make the journey to the Southern Empire, fighting, entering tournaments, and questing as he goes. Now that George is a mercenary captain, he gets paid based on his influence. Influence is gained mainly by fighting. Rather coincidentally, the Southern Empire declares war on the Western Empire. Now George has an enemy to fight.
Tell me your name.
He joins in a few battles and raids a few villages, and participates in a siege. He gets knocked out in the gatehouse. And through some dastardly betrayal, the army retreats, and George is left captured in the keep. Thankfully another army comes back, but his confidence in the kingdom is shaken. George decides to stay away from the front lines, and instead takes a quest to raid enemy villages. He still finds himself getting caught up in large battles, but overall, he slowly manages to build back up his company. Unfortunately, before he can complete his quest, peace is declared, and he's left out to dry. So he returns to questing, his company large enough to take on even the most difficult of tasks. Despite the numbers, his skill in commanding battles could still use some work. Not even a week after peace is declared, he finds himself dragged into a massive losing battle. As it turns out, the Southern Empire was at war with many more kingdoms. He's taken down and captured, but as usual, he eventually manages to slip away. The Southern Kingdom does not deserve him. It's time to leave. Once again, he was on the bottom rung of the ladder. He was even captured by lowly bandits. Thankfully, one of his companions returned from a quest with some men, and he was able to escape the fate of becoming a slave once more. Not even a day after leaving, he passes a battle that he would have surely been dragged into. At the very least, his fortune was slowly growing, now at nearly 30,000 dinars. He went to an arena and spent 8,000 to train his companions, but as it turns out, this just resets their perks, not increase their skills like he thought. So he decides to join the Northern Empire, since they were at war with the Nords, and was quickly pulled into battle. Unfortunately, they immediately sued for peace. Just like the Southern Empire, the Northerners also had many enemies. He found himself tasked with raiding Sturgeon villages, but again, peace was declared before he could finish. Being a mercenary really sucks. George wanted to have a say in all of this, but for that, he needed to become a vassal, and his clan was not renowned enough for that yet. He also had no influence, which is how he gets paid. Another way to gain influence is to donate troops to allied keeps, so George decides to downsize, and finds himself with a tidy profit. Unfortunately, this influence drops daily, at a crippling rate, and he soon finds his influence running dry. He tries more tournaments, but of course, he lacks any sort of skill required to win. Yay! So, how does George move forward? With a small capital investment, George can buy workshops and caravans. Since a workshop would bankrupt him, George decides instead to buy a caravan, assigning one of his companions to lead it. But that expends most of his wealth, so he decides to head north to look for trading flips. His increased trade skill allows him to gather trade rumours, so he heads to Tyal, where many goods bought by the Northern Empire are sold for cheap. It's slow going, but when he returns, he's able to tour the Empire, selling at each town for insane profits. He's able to buy a second caravan, and even buy the silversmith and brewery there. It seems like a good place to set up. It's in the middle of the Empire's territory, and on the water for trade. And with 2 workshops, The clan's renown is enough for tier 2. He still can't win a tourney though.
No quarter for the craven!
But before George can even consider becoming a vassal, war is again declared on the Nords. This could be the chance he was looking for. He receives a quest to test the enemy's defences, so he heads north into their territory. He buys a ship to sail across the sea and up a river, scouting the first castle before being intercepted. He scouts the second castle, but again, the Empire makes peace and he misses out on any kind of reward. This keeps happening because the three Empire factions sit in the middle of the map, surrounded by potential enemies. If any of them sense weakness, they quickly declare war, and the Empires find themselves constantly trying to make peace in order to redirect their forces, sometimes paying massive tributes to do so. The Northern Empire is now at war with the Britannians, but George doesn't care. He heads home to strengthen his own assets. Kingdom be damned. He buys another workshop, which he converts to a pottery shop due to low supply. He also tries to clean out the street gangs, while his companion reads a book. And he attempts to manipulate the market by stockpiling all the silver for his silversmith. He also tries weaponsmithing, but decides that it's not for him. His renown from trading brings the clan to tier 3, but the kingdom continues to find ever more enemies. If George wants to have any real control over his assets, he needs to become a vassal. And he doesn't even have to seek it out. This time, the Emperor himself invites George to pledge his allegiance. And so, Clan Unfjordunate officially joins the Northern Empire. Now, we're in the Endgame. George now has access to the Empire. He can now vote on decisions like peace, war, and policy, he can call armies to his banner, and most importantly, he can be given titles to castles and towns. His income and renown let him field a party of over 100 on his own, but he has little influence within the kingdom. As a mercenary, his influence was deducted each time he got paid. Now it only rises, and is used instead for decisions in the kingdom. It's terribly expensive, and George doesn't really know how to become influential, so for now, he focuses on raiding enemy villages and questing for the more powerful lords. That is until the Nords declare war again. This is George's chance for revenge. He calls up an army, buys some more ships, and sails north across the sea. He lands with 300 men, and begins reverse raiding the Vikings. He quickly catches the ire of the enemy, and finds himself commanding his first real battle.
Shoulder to shoulder! Engage the enemy! Miners, stay close! Charge!
Despite a valiant effort, they were losing. And eventually, George gets knocked out. His army is utterly defeated, and once again, George is captured by the Nords. 6 years of hard work, and he still couldn't beat an army that he significantly outnumbers. In reality, the Nords fielded a veteran army compared to the Empire's recruits. His commanding could have been better, but it wasn't the main reason for his defeat. George finds himself in the dungeons of Decisive, but it isn't long until he's able to bribe his way out. 6 long years, only to end up almost exactly where he started. But George still had his steed and his title. The fight isn't over yet. The Nords will pay. He rushes to the nearby villages, picking up recruits. Then he begins tackling bandits in order to train them up. His presence, however, doesn't go unnoticed, and he ends up tying down at least half of the Nord's armies as they try to intercept him. All the while, his party grew stronger, but the enemy was ever too close for him to raid villages. That is until he realised, if he sacrificed some men, he could indefinitely escape the enemy, and rehire more at each village. And eventually, his raiding earned him enough influence to call in armies from the Empire. But the distance meant it would take them ages to travel, and before they arrived, the kingdom tried suing for peace. But this time, with George's influence, they opted to continue the fight, and slowly, the troops began to arrive. But the Nords catch one of them, and George has to choose between abandoning his army or committing to a battle with poor odds. The army was absolutely slaughtered. After half a year of raiding, he's taken back to Gretti's Fjord dungeon. Resigned, he bribes his way out again, and retreats to his fleet. Which is gone. Looks like he's walking back to the Empire. Again. After re-recruiting a party and fat-fingering the surrender option, breaking out and getting caught again, another vote for peace is called. It's probably for the best. The Empire even got some tribute thanks to the work he did. And with that, George is able to make his long march home in peace. He hires a new companion, who he assigns to lead a party. The benefit of this is that any party within Clan Unfjordunate can be called into an army for free, plus they recruit their own troops. This is pretty helpful, since George struggles to fill his own ranks. When he finally returns home, he's losing money. So he hires a new caravan, this time with better guards, and decides to try another tournament. Despite hours of meditating in his mind palace,
And I love it.
he's still unable to win. It really was a fluke the first time. He was really trying, even training in the practice arena. He could consistently make it to the last round, but for some reason, victory evaded him. He even tried taking on looters, using techniques the guys in his mind palace taught him. But like, where they could stay on the edge of enemies, George got immediately surrounded.
Help me!
Over the years, he'd gradually improved his gear, but now he decided to switch to a two-handed axe as his main weapon. It could break through shields, and even hit multiple enemies. Only time would tell if this is the edge he needed. At the very least, all this training brought the clan to tier 4. And so, with everything he's learned, he entered one more tournament. That was easy. Let's see if he can win another. Never mind.
Glory!
I guess some things never change. The other lords vote to declare war on the Western Empire, and with the kingdom down to only 4 towns, George decides to get involved. He finds himself in the plains of the old empire, raiding villages and taking on smaller parties. And after freeing a captured lord, he finds that he's been gifted a castle. He is moments from being captured himself, but manages to broker a peace just in time. That short war played incredibly into George's favour. As bountiful as it may seem, it may just turn out to be a poisoned chalice. It's far from friendly territory, neighbouring multiple potential enemies. Regardless, George settles in, sitting on a throne for the first time. Castles, unlike towns, are mostly defensive. They do turn a small profit from the bound villages, but they contain no market, workshop, or recruitment centre. The settlement itself will slowly train up a militia, which George can take from, but it's best left in the garrison for defence and security. All he's really able to do is upgrade the facilities, increasing prosperity, recruitment, and defence. After putting some money into the town, he's dangerously low on funds, so he decides to cut his parties. They'd been called into armies during the war, and lost almost all of their men anyway. After another tournament fluke, he facilitates a trade agreement with the Western Empire, trying to ensure peace. But instead, it's the Kazates that declare war. They had already taken Argaron in a previous war, and were threatening to shrink the ever-weakening Northern Empire, so George got to work. First, he joined the siege of Atrion Castle, which was taken at the same time as Argaron. Then they quickly marched on to siege Jorgary's castle. But when they continued on to the city of Mazia, the first Empire city taken by the Kazates, the army abandons the siege, and George is caught in a counterattack, having to sacrifice men to escape. It would have been an easy siege too. George took a quick break to win his third tourney, before returning to the Empire to find that Argaron had been retaken. 2 castles and a city in only a few months. The war was going exceptionally well, until the Western Empire declared war, and immediately began raiding George's villages. He wasted no time in calling an army, and securing peace with the Kazay. He meets a disorganized force on his march, and finds himself commanding his second major battle. His first major victory It was a long time coming. As he defeats and chases armies in the field, his castle is besieged and taken over. It was simply too far from the Empire's territory to defend, and all his investment was lost. George moves to threaten the city of Amitatis in retaliation, and is confronted with an even larger battle. It's another glorious victory. George then joins a siege to retake his castle, which was left lightly defended. It's an easy fight, and he's subsequently given the fief again. But as he leaves, it again comes under siege. What purpose does it serve to defend it? George moves instead to expand the Empire's true border, rather than fight over a ruined castle. He finds himself leading his first siege of Hertogia Castle, but this is George's first time commanding a siege. No longer is he rallying a small squadron of men in an overlord's siege. This time, every man is under his command, and it does not go well. He rushes his troops to the wall to avoid archers and catapults, but instead finds that a third of his forces are dead before they even breach the gate. He commands his infantry through the gate and rallies his men up the ladders. The troops in the gatehouse were faltering, so he rushed to reinforce them, finding them holding at the inner gate as rocks were lobbed at them. He hacked at the door himself, his men unwilling to do it themselves. And through sheer force of will, he burst through. It was an abysmal siege. Half his army dead, half of those remaining wounded. He spends the remainder of the war raiding deep into enemy territory to rebuild his spent influence, until he had enough to once again call an army to besiege Amitatis. The Western Empire musters up an army to relieve the city, and the war culminates in the largest battle George has ever commanded. He could sacrifice his men to escape, but that would only weaken him. So, he forms up his men for one last decisive battle. He spends the remainder of the war imprisoned in Amitatis. Despite his best efforts, 2 castles were lost, and the kingdom was forced to pay tribute. When he was released, he once again had no castles to his name. He returned to Diaphma empty-handed. George did have one thing going for him though, an obscene amount of money. While war is expensive, George had set up his workshops and caravans in the centre of the kingdom, where they could safely make profits. A man can do a lot with 1 million dinars, but he still massively lacked influence. The system was rigged to keep small clans from growing too large, and he was feeling it. So, he decided to marry. Unfortunately, the lords of many prospective wives were captured in a massive battle with the Kazays, so he'd have to wait. And the wars were stacking up again. The Kazays besieged Argaron again, and the Battanians and Nords declare war. Down to just 3 towns, it felt like the Empire was falling apart around him. George found himself constantly abandoning troops to escape capture. He even found himself beaten by a mere militia. The Kazays refused peace, and the Empire threw another doomed castle at him. And so, George gave them an ultimatum: defend his city, or he abandons the kingdom. Miraculously, what must be the entire kingdom came to lift the siege. It was a sign. George must remain with the Northern Empire until his last breath. He meets with the Emperor and offers to marry his niece, Valeriza. 10 years after his initial escape, George marries into the Northern Empire, sealing his fate. He had never met his wife before this moment, and found her to be extremely talented. She was proficient in combat, and had leadership skills that put George to shame. His wife taught him how to view his influence, which, with a new perk, could be used to increase relations for free through tactical voting. He could also use it to propose policies, which he begins by proposing a raiding policy. Sadly, his castle was bugged, so he released it back into the kingdom. He didn't want to get caught up in its defense anyway. He had some plans with this new raiding policy. He upgraded his fleet, and with his personal party now at almost 200, he headed north to the Nord's territory. He wins a quick tournament, earning him a new helmet, before calling in an army and calling for war. Unfortunately, the Empire votes down his declaration, so George takes things into his own hands and attacks a village, forcing war. This comes with a staggering hit to his influence, meaning he's unable to maintain the army. Knowing this, he commits to as many battles as he can, culminating in a fight that he can't win. He fights it, but this time tactically retreats in order to escape. The army would have soon abandoned him anyway. Sneaking away, he tackles a hideout again, and he's finally able to succeed in a stealth mission.
Cut them down! The day is ours!
He gets caught in another battle he can't win, and fearing his imminent capture, he escapes with his imprisoned lord and executes him. This was perhaps not the smartest idea, since George's fleet was docked in Gretisfjord. He did, however, evade capture, although he was progressing slowly in the war all on his own. He raids enough villages to regain some influence, and calls in a small army. He waits for them at Balticamp, even winning a tournament there.
The day is ours!
Then he heads back to the Nord's territory with his army, and is quickly defeated. He escapes, but the Emperor steps in and forges a peace. Perhaps it's time to put this blind vengeance to bed. As if to appease his nephew-in-law, the Emperor gifts George a castle conquered from the Britannians. So George returns home and begins raiding, but again, his castle doesn't last. And after half a year successfully raiding every Britannian village, he suffers a catastrophic defeat, and spends the remainder of the war in the dungeons of Dunglanis. The Empire was still at war with the Sturgeons, who had a castle within the borders of the Empire. This would be the perfect castle for George. It would be protected by the Empire's core cities of Epicratrea and Diaphna, and with no fiefs to his name, George would certainly get it. So he assigned his best companion to be his engineer, called in a massive army, and sieged Mecalovia castle.
Shields up!
The castle went to George, but an army was mustering just outside. He formed up to meet them, but failed to realise he deployed in a terribly compromised position. By the time he realised and retreated, it was too late. He didn't have enough men to escape. He had, however, managed to weaken the enemy enough so that they couldn't threaten his castle. He was able to bribe his way out. Twice. And returned to his new castle to recover. He immediately stashed supplies in the castle, just in case he got captured again, before raising another party to raid the enemy. All was going well, until he accidentally donated his entire army to Epic Retreya. Oops. So he takes the garrison from his castle and calls an army to begin sieging the enemy. With a good engineer and some patience, the siege is a breeze. Unfortunately, his efforts go to another lord. So he sieges another castle, and is rewarded by getting another policy passed, and a ceasefire with the Sturgeons. At last, George had some peace, and finally got to have some quality time with his wife. George started getting worried. He needed an heir, and despite months of Valeriza still hadn't fallen pregnant. This is when he realises that the Emperor set him up with an old, barren woman, who also apparently doesn't like him. He needs a wife who can bear him a child. He goes for a stroll to cool off. Thankfully, George is a reasonable man. He's got his head screwed on right. Same can't be said for his wife though. Hark! 'Tis a day of tragedy in the kingdom. George's heart will never... George finds a suitable wife, and heads over to Epic Retreya to meet her. There's a tournament there, so he enters, and even wins for her. Look at the crown he won. Fit for a king.
Would you care to tell me your good name?
She's so into him. There is no way that George can fumble the... George is in the market for a new wife. He's looking for someone in their 20s or 30s, with good leadership skills, and is available to marry. There are a few good candidates, no one as good as that stupid but as he tours the land to meet them, many of them are already married. Eventually, he meets Hippolyte, and decides to marry her. He begins courting her, but the Southern Empire declares war. This is more important. After tirelessly courting her for 24 hours, she agrees to marry. He just needs her father's approval. He calls in an army, just in case. Apparently he didn't get the memo. I guess he is on the front line with the Southern Empire War going on. So, George spends some time defending his land and raiding the enemy. He ends up touring much of the Southern Empire's territory, culminating in their entire armed forces chasing him down. As a result, George devises the strategy of raiding enemy villages, forcing them to give him recruits, then sacrificing said troops to escape the pursuing armies. After almost an entire year of fighting, he returns to Hippolyte's father, but he's still not interested in talking about the marriage. To be fair, the kingdom is about to drop down to 2 towns, which would make it the weakest kingdom in Calradia. So George marches over to Lycaron, which is under siege, and jukes all the enemy armies until the siege is done. Then, he has a eureka moment. If George is without a fief, he'll take top priority when a new fief is taken. He quickly relinquishes the right to his castle, and the town falls as George continues to juke the armies. The vote for the new city comes in. It worked! George is now the 3rd most powerful lord in the kingdom. All of a sudden, Hippolyte's father was all over the marriage. Yeah, now you're interested. She has amazing stewarding and engineering skills, so George assigns her to govern Lycaron. Towns have a little more going on than castles. Firstly, they have more building slots, which George quickly assigns, but they also have markets, arenas, workshops, and basically an entire castle too. The state of the market affects the town's prosperity, in turn affecting its profit. Prosperity is affected by food supply, town security, and loyalty. With it being an empire town, governed by George's wife, who is from the empire, security and loyalty won't be a problem. He even retrains her to maximize her governing potential. What George can do is buy up a ton of grain from the surrounding lands to bulk up the supply in town, but not too much, otherwise caravans will buy it up to sell to other towns. This also increases the amount of time the town can survive a siege. He also stashes some supplies in case he needs them for his party. And finally, back to the issue of an heir. George spends all of his time in the new city with his wife. He wins a tournament,
Heaven be praised.
hires and fires the world's worst companion, and makes a ton of money. Through a lucky event, his relations with all of the notables in town increase enough so that he can hire every possible recruit, and after war being declared with the Sturgeons, finally, his wife falls pregnant. The fate of Clan Unfjordunate is almost secure. The Battanians declare war as George's party heads over. This is actually quite ideal. Lycaron is far from the front line. Unfortunately, it's not long before the Aserai declare war, putting the town in danger. He rushes home and lights the fires of war. The Aserai are a formidable enemy. Like the Kazay, they live on the fringes of the continent and have slowly expanded rather than squabble like the Empire. George personally gets involved to save an ally and gets a false sense of confidence due to their cavalry advantage. Clan Unfjordunate is almost at Clan Tier 6, the highest it can go, and George himself has become a formidable leader. One of his perks means that he can use equipment to train up his men, and he realises he can just buy the cheapest tools from town to speed up the process. With enemies commanding dozens of towns, troop quality is going to be a lot more important than quantity. And as if to test that theory, the Aserai siege the newly acquired town of Poros. Oh, they had an executioner's axe. I wonder what that was for.
They will remember this!
Despite the victory, the enemy's elite infantry are vastly superior to the Empire's. The only reason George survived was because he was able to keep the enemy armies separate, meaning that the Second Army had to build another siege camp, giving George's wounded troops time to recover. A better way to prove this point is when the Southern Empire declares war and sieges Lycaron, George wipes the floor with them. Empire troops just don't hold a candle to the Aserai. George is sieging a castle when an enemy army starts mustering behind him. His companion Farim the engineer single-handedly holds the line as George arrives. he's forced to retreat and fall back to defend Lycaron. But with his veterans dead, what should have been an easy siege turned into a nightmare. To buy more time, he periodically sallied forth to destroy siege equipment and whittle down their army. And having bought time for 4 catapults to be built, they just about make the difference. George practically has the entire Western Empire's nobility in his prison at this point, including the Empress.
I don't know what we have to say to each other.
Huh?
The thought of executing them crosses his mind, but no, that would create a grudge so deep it might as well be suicide. Before he can get any kind of benefit from them, the Empire votes for peace, and they're all released for free. In fact, George has to pay them. The Northern Empire is getting weaker by the day. George heads north to help in the Britannian War, and heads several large battles and sieges.
Cut them down!
The Empire has so many clans with no fiefs, they don't even consider George for the new castles. And worse, he loses Farim, his engineer. Sieges are going to be a lot harder from now on. George's participation in the war climaxes with a huge 2,000-man battle. It's devastating for both sides, and it comes down to the last 100 men. But when George falls, the battle is quickly lost. When he's released, he returns home. George is pushing 40, still with no heir. So he doesn't leave his wife's side until she falls pregnant. Clan Unfjordunate is now the most powerful family in the Northern Empire, meaning any policy can be forced through by outbidding the other families over and over until they run out of influence. But despite everything George has done, The Northern Empire is withering more and more, and the other empires circle like vultures. He's constantly at war with multiple empires, and while some castles fall beneath George's boot, the tides of enemy armies never stop. And when he returns home again, the largest army George has ever seen marches over the hill, towards Lycaron. But on the other horizon, Penton, with another massive army, is moving on a collision course. With the Aserai's superior infantry, George isn't confident that this is a fight they could win. And Penton's mission apparently wasn't to defend Lycaron. Fortunately, this catches the attention of the enemy army, and a wild goose chase ensues. Penton cannot siege with the danger of an enemy army lurking nearby, but isn't strong enough to face them. The enemy is stronger, but too slow to catch them. Each army calls in more troops as the dance continues, but the numbers stay even. That is until the mercenaries of Penton's army desert him. Now the Empire definitely cannot win. George's only hope was to stay as close as possible to the enemy army, while Pentos sieges Poros. But George cannot let Lycaron be sieged. He's been given a son. There's only one option. Pray that Pentos captured the city and lure the enemy into a siege, dooming Penton's army. Something was different this time. The Aserai were out for blood. Their army was built of their most elite and veteran troops, while the Empire's faltering forces consisted of only peons and peasants. The atmosphere was grim with dread. Without George, the Northern Empire collapsed. The pressure of the changing world was too much to bear, but the bodies of Hippolyte and her newborn son were never found. If you'd like to see this continue to a world conquest, do let me know below with a like, comment, and subscribe.